Kirsten, over to you.
Thank you, Grace. Hi, everybody. My name is Kirsten Verclas. I'm Senior Managing Director at the National Association of State Energy Officials, or NASEO. And I'm very excited to welcome you to this webinar, not only on behalf of NASEO, but also on behalf of my colleagues from the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, or NARUC. A lot of times NASEO and NARUC do webinars such as these and other efforts together, and I'm really excited to see so many state energy offices and public utility commissions on the call. A lot of the states are grappling with tremendous changes in the electricity sector. We're experiencing load growth and unprecedented levels. There is a lot of questions on affordability and rate increase that are coupled with this load growth. There's a lot of challenges and opportunities in terms of economic development tied to the energy sector. And we're all thinking, especially right now on the East Coast, staring down a winter storm, a lot about resilience and reliability of the electricity sector. And most of the time, when we're thinking about these issues, or the states are thinking about these issues, there's a lot of interest in understanding how can we make the transmission and distribution sector more efficient, more reliable, more resilient. And when it comes to these advanced grid technologies, there's a lot of questions and a lot of need for information to provide to the states, the state energy offices, and the public utility commissions alike. And so I'm very excited that Lawrence Berkeley National Lab has embarked on this regulatory sandboxes approach and technical assistance for the states to really think and try out some of these considerations around advanced grid technologies. NASEO and NARUC work really closely with the national labs. We've seen their state technical assistance offers in the past, and they've always been wonderful. So I really, really appreciate not just the expertise, but also the technical assistance support that the national labs are providing. And I'm really excited about this new offer for state energy offices and public utility commissions. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Grace to walk us through what they're thinking.
Fantastic. Thanks for that intro. Let me share my screen here. Okay. All right, so thank you so much for that intro. It really teed up a lot of the issues that states are facing and reasons why we need to start testing advanced grid technologies. My name is Grace Relf. I am a policy researcher at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And I'm here today to discuss our research on regulatory sandboxes and an associated technical assistance opportunity for state utility commissions and state energy offices. I am similarly very excited about this opportunity. I'm grateful that you all are here to learn more about it. Just as a little background too, before joining the lab, I worked as the Chief of Policy and Research at the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission, where we worked to stand up one of these sandbox type mechanisms as an innovative pilot process. So I have a little experience with, kind of how to set these up and why they're important and what they can achieve. So first, I'm going to go over some of our research on regulatory sandboxes. I know that this is a topic that's not necessarily familiar to everybody, so wanted to give you an understanding of what this mechanism is and why you might pursue one. And hopefully this will give you some ideas for what you might request out of a technical assistance opportunity. And then we'll get into sort of those opportunities in the second half of the discussion. I would love your questions. This is an opportunity for NARUC and NASEO members to ask about TA and about this type of mechanism. So please do put your questions into the chat box, and we'll be taking those at different points throughout the webinar today. All right, so let's get into the substance here. We were motivated to do research on regulatory sandboxes because of what Kirsten mentioned. There are so many increasing demands facing utility systems right now, and the need for utilities to innovate and adopt new technologies is only growing. We also know that regulatory change doesn't always keep pace with technological change, which, especially right now with the rise of AI and all these different innovators out there, is really growing exponentially. The graphic on this slide kind of shows some of that, how regulatory innovation does not keep up with technology innovation. And so regulatory sandboxes can be a tool to help bridge that gap and help utilities test and scale new technologies with guardrails in place. Our research focused particularly on how regulatory sandboxes can support advanced grid technologies. These are advanced technologies, services, or applications that enhance transmission and distribution, or T&D systems. Some examples included on this slide, but there are many others, include dynamic line rating, advanced conductors or transformers. We're seeing a whole host of other technologies that utilities are testing, and we're actually cataloging some of those as part of this project as well. These are really critical resources to help meet new demands on the system in a cost-effective manner. And there's significant opportunity to deploy these in the near term to increase our transmission and distribution capacity and provide greater value to customers. So for example, research has found that technologies that exist today could increase T&D capacity at lower cost than like-for-like replacements and be adopted and scaled much more quickly compared to how long it actually takes to design and construct new transmission or distribution equipment. However, there are a lot of barriers to being able to implement those types of technologies. So for example, cost of service regulation and cost recovery practices can incentivize utilities to invest in capital intensive and more tried and true technologies. One, because they'll be able to earn a return on those investments. And they also have better certainty that regulators are going to approve cost recovery for those investments when there's a bigger evidence bank that we know they'll be successful. Some other barriers in the regulatory space to innovation can be the length of the regulatory process, which of course is in place for a reason, but can still hinder innovation. And on the technology side, utilities want to ensure that new products are not going to be unsafe or cause reliability issues. So smaller trials can be more attractive, but then there aren't always clear pathways for those technologies and those trials to actually get to scale on the utility system. So what is a regulatory sandbox? A regulatory sandbox is a mechanism that modifies rules or regulations to allow experimentation and help scale solutions more quickly. In general, a regulatory sandbox is different from a traditional pilot process because it explicitly allows utilities to deviate from the traditional regulatory process or framework in some way, usually for a limited amount of time or with other guardrails in place to help make sure that we're still keeping consumer protection top of mind. A big focus of regulatory sandboxes abroad is waiving licensing requirements. That helps to remove some of the regulatory burdens on innovators that can otherwise limit the ability to quickly test technologies that we don't even know if they'll work before they move to scale. One example of a regulatory sandbox is the Innovative Energy Solutions, or IES program in Connecticut. This program uses a 4-phase cycle to identify, test, and scale innovative ideas. The key is that there are unique aspects of this sandbox that create more flexibility outside of the traditional regulatory process and review mechanisms. So in Connecticut, they use an advisory council with external experts, external to the Utility Commission, to help select projects. And they also allow non-utilities to run programs through their sandbox. And then they have a strong focus on scaling as well. As another example, in Vermont, they have a pilot process where pilots actually do not require any regulatory approval at all, as long as they're within the parameters of the program. That's kind of an overview of a regulatory sandbox, is trying to modify our regulatory mechanisms so that we can overcome barriers to innovation. Sandbox mechanisms can be structured in different ways. We reviewed the landscape of US sandboxes and kind of grouped them into 4 common types of sandboxes. The first are funding mechanisms, which carve out a pool of funding for innovative projects. These commonly act sort of like a grant mechanism where projects are awarded funding if they meet selection or eligibility criteria. The deviation from a traditional regulatory framework here is that there is pre-identified funding available. Pilot processes aim to modify how utilities have typically run pilots to help make sure that they are creating meaningful learning outcomes and that successful trials can scale. So for example, this might look like an expedited review timeline, or providing more certainty around cost recovery than under traditional regulatory review of pilot applications. The deviation here is that usually the review process is very much sped up. So in Hawaii, there's a 45-day review period for pilot applications, or other states use a 90-day period or even no review period at all. And so this is really sped up compared to the traditional regulatory process. In some cases, utility commissions we've seen use rate cases or rulemakings to advance innovation or to establish a sandbox mechanism, such as through a multi-year rate plan. And then finally, a more kind of traditional or focused regulatory sandbox would include some specific modification to rules or regulation that usually focuses on testing new regulatory regimes or business models that can promote innovation. These focus more on like the regulatory construct and framework rather than on testing specific technologies or programs. In June, we released a detailed report on this topic, and we've also recently released a toolkit on our webpage. This is intended to help states set up regulatory sandbox. So there's a lot of great info in both of these resources. In particular, the toolkit has a library of example projects that Sandboxes have supported and model guidelines that utilities or regulators or other stakeholders can download and use to your heart's content as a starting point for adopting a sandbox in your jurisdiction. They're intended to be sort of a copy paste and adaptable resource for you to have a good starting point on that. Our research included a literature review of regulatory proceedings, and interviews to help us identify what sandboxes are out there and best practices and emerging practices relating to sandboxes as well. Through our research, we found 15 examples of sandbox type mechanisms, 12 of which were adopted and are still in effect today. There's a really nice mix of those kind of 4 sandbox types that I was discussing. And there is really good geographic diversity of states that are using these mechanisms as well. I'm also aware of at least one more sandbox type mechanism that's been adopted since we published our report. So the momentum is continuing to grow here. This slide shows some examples of different types of sandboxes that we identified. So the Connecticut IES program is a sandbox that allows utilities, innovators, or collaborative partnerships between those two entities to propose new programs and technology trials. The IES program uses thematic calls for proposals, and then an Innovation Advisory Council helps to select a group of those that ultimately get approved by the regulatory authority for funding. The program is somewhat unique, as I mentioned, in that non-utilities can propose ideas. And this is a really good practice to help get more ideas on the table and to really kind of see what's out there in the industry. As part of the New York Reforming the Energy Vision process, they had an explicit focus on innovation. And so they set up both what they call innovation sprints and demonstration projects or demos. The demos are intended to trial new revenue models and partnerships that help build value for customers and that can scale easily. And then I mentioned that in Hawaii, I worked at the PUC when we developed the innovative pilot framework as part of the holistic performance-based regulation framework for Hawaiian Electric. We recognize that some of the cost control measures as part of the PBR framework potentially could limit innovation. So we developed this framework that carves out a pool of funding for innovative projects and then really speeds up that review timeline so that we can try things, see if they work, and get them to scale more quickly. There are also a few great examples of sandboxes from abroad. These innovation sandboxes test new technologies and programs, and they all place a particular emphasis on going beyond just demonstrating technical feasibility and really testing new regulatory models and overcoming regulatory barriers. The UK's Office of Gas and Electricity Markets, or Ofgem, developed a sandbox also as part of a performance-based regulation framework. Their mechanism focuses heavily on relaxing, modifying, or removing specific rules or regulations for a period of time that innovators have identified that are challenges to getting their technologies tested and adopted. Ontario similarly has a sandbox that has a strong focus on providing direct support to industry innovators. So those companies and organizations can connect directly with regulatory staff for advisory services to help understand the landscape of how their innovation might fit in within the regulatory construct. They've also run some fun competition type calls for proposals that have increased engagement with the sandbox because they had funding tied to them. Singapore also formalized a sandbox in 2017 after having issued sort of ad hoc exemptions to regulations to support innovation there. And they formalized that approach back in 2017. I think it's important to mention these examples because they really have served as foundational examples for the sandboxes that we've developed in the US. So through our research, we were able to catalog the different types of mechanisms that are out there and then identify emerging best practices for designing and implementing sandboxes. To me, a really important point here is that folks involved with these sandbox mechanisms that we interviewed and spoke to almost across the board felt that they've been really successful for many reasons, a few of which are shown on this slide. A number of the benefits of sandboxes relate to the outcomes that you can achieve by testing specific programs or technologies. So for example, testing technologies that aim to improve reliability or affordability or increase access to technologies. But in addition to just testing new technologies and programs, we also heard that a really important benefit of sandboxes has to do with creating a culture of innovation at utilities and regulatory agencies that support innovation in the industry. That we found that can have spillover effects too, where sort of you're creating a broader ecosystem of innovation in the state. Sandboxes can also help reduce the cost of innovation and create evidence around new technologies in the market for them. So that information sharing piece really helps to further kind of spill over the benefits of sandboxes more widely as well. There are a few areas where sandbox design and implementation can be improved. So for example, there can be a stronger focus on how projects will get to scale. A lot of these sandboxes are still pretty new, so there's room for improvement in that area. And any sandbox is going to come with some risks, but these can largely be mitigated with thoughtful design and monitoring over time. But of course, as you're setting up your sandbox, you want to be thoughtful about kind of how you're thinking about risk and how you might be able to mitigate that with your implementation and design choices. All right, so that's what I had in terms of thinking about regulatory sandboxes. I want to pause and maybe see if there are any clarifying questions, maybe about what sandboxes are or what they achieve, before jumping into an overview of the technical assistance opportunity.
Grace, there are some questions on the technical assistance opportunity, which we'll get to now. But one overarching question is if you will be able to share the PowerPoint presentation with participants.
Yes, absolutely. The PowerPoint is actually already linked on our webpage, so I'll be happy to put a link to the chat in there as well, but you should be able to find it on our webpage.
Great. And then there's one other question on a sandbox. I think that you mentioned that happened in Vermont. Green Mountain Power has unilateral ability to implement small pilots, and how is this done, and how do you kind of balance innovation, incentive, and risk reduction?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the structure in Vermont is such that they have a very clear outline for the types of pilots that are acceptable, that they need to be expected to be cost beneficial and net beneficial to all ratepayers, not just participants in the program. So there are these kind of like boundaries on what the utility can propose. When the utility is ready to run a pilot, they submit what they call a notice of intent or a pilot notice to the commission. That's 15 days in advance of when they plan to start that pilot. And the utility commission can respond if they want to. So if they don't feel like the pilot is in line with their guidelines or they have questions or concerns, the commission can, you know, pause that implementation or raise concerns, modifications, or not allow that to go forward. But if the commission does not act quickly, or doesn't respond, then that's considered approval and the utility can move forward with implementing that program. So it's, there are trade-offs here. I think that you have to be thoughtful about kind of the guidelines you put in place to manage risk and be willing to review things quickly. But it does allow the utility to kind of innovate, think quickly, move very quickly. So there are benefits there as well. And we've seen a lot of successful pilots come out of that program in Vermont that have actually gone to scale as well. I think one interesting piece of that framework too is that after the pilot period ends, if it's been successful, the utility is able to move that to tariff very quickly. So that's kind of why we've seen some of those scale as well.
Great. And in the meantime, there have actually been a number of questions coming in on the
Oh, great.
sandbox. So I'm
Okay.
going to go for a few more and then maybe table the rest for after you've finished your presentation. But one question was if you could elaborate on how these sandboxes are funded in the states that have undertaken this.
Yeah, it varies state by state. So there are different kind of mechanisms. So in California, they have an innovation program that's funded via a ratepayer surcharge. And that was set up legislatively. And now that funding is split between the utilities and the California Energy Commission and kind of goes to different innovation buckets. In Hawaii, there is a carve out of funding available for the utility, sort of like a maximum amount that the utility can spend on these innovative pilots every year. And then, as long as the utility has sort of been in line with what the commission expected, annually they put forward how much they actually spent, and that goes to approval for the commission for recovery in customer rates. There are other mechanisms too, where some states do have used federal funding to supplement these programs and fund innovation programs. So kind of varies state by state. Typically, the commission will establish like a maximum cost cap on the total program for the sandbox as well as for innovation pilots themselves. So it just kind of varies, but there are a lot of different opportunities there to think about how you can creatively and effectively fund these.
Great. Thank you. And you already alluded to kind of where the proposals for the sandbox come from. Either it's like with the PUC regulation and the fund associated, or sometimes the utility will approach the PUC. Have you also ever seen them coming out of a legislative mandate? We're entering, state legislative season, so that might be interesting to hear if there's also been a legislative push.
Great question. I think tangentially a little bit. Some of these I see very much tied to legislative goals for, improving reliability or adopting new technologies or sort of those higher level energy sector objectives. I have seen some legislation specifically proposing sandboxes. Some of them I know were not actually approved, but that legislation does exist out there. I'd have to go back and sort of collect examples of sandboxes that are specifically coming out of legislation, but it's definitely possible.
Great, thank you. We do have a number of other questions, but I want you to have enough time to go over like the actual technical assistance. So we'll do that then, and then we might come back to some of the other outstanding questions. But keep them coming, people.
Great, thanks so much. All right, so let's get into the technical assistance opportunity. So in partnership with the U.S. Department of Energy, we are really excited to be able to support jurisdictions in developing and implementing regulatory sandboxes or other innovative approaches, something like pilots or novel programs for deployment of advanced grid technologies for T&D systems. Groups that are eligible for technical assistance right now include public utility commissions, state energy offices, and public power and cooperative utilities. So This webinar is largely focused on how we can help PUCs and state energy offices with help from NARUC and NASEO, but public power and cooperative utilities are also eligible right now. We're offering 3 different levels of technical assistance. So at the lightest touch level, we can provide educational briefings and presentations to groups on request. The next level up is expert assistance. We go a little deeper here with some narrowly focused questions or support on a specific element of sandboxes or testing and scaling advanced T&D technologies. And then finally, we have a deep dive option for organizations that want help kind of from soup to nuts developing and beginning to implement a sandbox or a similar approach. I view this TA opportunity as relatively flexible. So if your jurisdiction maybe is a little wary of the term regulatory sandbox, or you have another creative idea that supports innovation and advanced T&D technologies at utilities, please apply, please reach out, and we can see whether or not it's a good fit for the program. Just to get a little bit deeper on the different options here, the first is what we're calling sandbox exploration. This option is for states or utilities that want more information about sandboxes and innovation vehicles for advanced T&D technologies. The goal with this option is to provide some of that foundational information on what sandboxes are, how you might deploy them, what they can achieve, and then also about advanced T&D technologies themselves. When we were doing this research, we found that there is not often widespread familiarity with regulatory sandboxes and how they can help jurisdictions. So this option can really help to get that conversation started and kind of level set with stakeholders in your jurisdiction. For this option, we will tailor our educational materials to your specific needs and questions and work to make sure that the information we're providing is as useful for your specific context as possible. Some examples here of what we could cover are things like providing examples of projects in other jurisdictions that have been deployed to address challenges that you're facing in your jurisdiction. Talking about strategies to overcome pilot purgatory, or how to kind of quickly and effectively scale successful trials for advanced grid technologies, and articulating the benefits of sandboxes for different types of stakeholders. So kind of getting people interested in the topic. We can also specifically respond to questions or possible concerns from various stakeholders and illustrate possible mitigations. This one is super easy to quote unquote apply for. You just need to send me an email. If in your email you can include information for me about what type of education that you're looking for, what questions that you have, and sort of when you're looking for this information, that would be great. But just send me an email at any time and we can discuss how to get this going. At the next level of engagement, we're calling this expert assistance. We'd go deeper. This is intended for about 2 or 3 entities per year and will help on a specific question or need that you have. At this level of support, technical assistance can help states or utilities that maybe already have a good sense of how to structure a sandbox, but need support to develop specific design aspects or implement specific aspects. Or maybe you have an existing sandbox or innovation mechanism, but want help improving something about it or addressing a specific challenge that you're running into. We anticipate that these engagements will be more involved and run over the course of several months. So again, this is flexible, but some ideas to kind of get the juices flowing on this. For example, we could help you to identify what the barriers to innovation in your jurisdiction are, and then potential modifications to rules and regulations to enable innovation, of course, keeping in mind consumer protections as well. We could use the model straw sandbox proposal that we've developed and start to tailor that to your state's specific needs and get it ready for consideration by stakeholders and utility commissions. We could help develop streamlined and standardized templates for things like project applications, project reviews, reporting, evaluation, those kinds of things. We could also help refine the process for scaling successful trials and pilots, help design stakeholder engagement processes, or review specific elements of an existing sandbox framework to make sure that it's functioning well, identify areas for improvement, or develop possible solutions. What we would do here is maybe provide a series of educational webinars, produce templates or documents or other work products that would be useful for you at your energy office or utility commission, or help you with real-time problem solving and sort of act as a sounding board or expert, subject matter expert on topics here. So for this option, we'd like you to fill out a short form to let us know what your questions and challenges are. I'll go over the form a bit more in a minute, but it's quite easy to access and fill out. Finally, the most involved type of assistance is called a deep dive. This will allow us to work with 2 states or utilities per year over the course of many months, even potentially up to a year or maybe a little over. This level of technical assistance provides support for building a sandbox from the ground up. We'll draw on emerging best practices and the lessons that we see from the sandboxes that we've studied. We could help you to initiate sandbox implementation, create a sandbox framework that meets your specific objectives, address stakeholder comments, and even begin to help implement the sandbox. So for example, we could develop that sandbox framework and straw proposal. Again, develop some of those streamlined templates for project applications, reviews, or reporting and evaluation. Could help you as energy office or PUC staff develop your internal staff processes. So I know from experience working at the Hawaii PUC that it's challenging to review projects on a very expedited timeline. So we can kind of help you set up processes to do that effectively and well. We could provide consultations during stakeholder engagement or working group processes, and even, provide consultation as you are reviewing initial project proposals. We could also consider other alternative creative ideas for assistance at this level if anything comes to mind. So let us know what your specific challenges are and how we can help you. For this option, we similarly ask that you fill out that same short form online and let us know kind of what you're thinking about for technical assistance here. The form is pretty limited, so I hope it won't take you too much time to fill out. It has 10 questions total, 4 of which are kind of more on the substantive side. The form requests information on who will be participating or involved in the technical assistance request, the role your organization plays in implementing an innovation type program, and then why you're interested in this topic. So what are the challenges your state is facing with regards to innovation and the need for advanced grid technologies? And then finally, we'd like more information on what your vision is for the technical assistance. Do you have specific needs, questions, or outcomes that you'd hope to see? And on what timeline can we help you? These are our selection criteria. We are looking for organizations and applications that show that, 1, your organization is able to act on the information and the assistance provided. So, for example, maybe there is a defined and already defined path for how you might act on the technical assistance. So maybe there's an open proceeding or a planned proceeding. You have stated objectives related to advanced T&D technologies. Maybe there is related legislation out there, or there's some other sort of path for, or you're able to implement the assistance that we'll provide. Second, that your goals are aligned with using innovation vehicles and sandbox mechanisms to test and scale advanced grid technologies, particularly to support reliability and affordability. 3, that your technical assistance is highly likely to have a significant impact. So what that, particularly on reliability and affordability outcomes. So this means that the project addresses a critical and widespread challenge, and that the outcomes could potentially be scalable to other jurisdictions or organizations. Maybe that the outcomes will be replicable or could inform industry-wide best practices. And then on the more logistical side of things, we will look to make sure that we can actually meet your needs with our expertise and in a timely manner. And we'll aim to select a balanced portfolio of organizations from different regions, different areas of the country, and with different types of questions. Well, finally, just a couple of minor tips here. So first, I know that this is a new topic to many people in organizations. So even if you're not totally sure what assistance you need or what would be most helpful from us, Please do your best to fill out the questions with what you do know, and feel free to reach out to me if you want to kind of discuss further before filling out the form. Um, if there's anything that might be helpful for us in assessing your application, like a link to a white paper or a proceeding or a docket, a decision in order, something like that, please do include those links. That'll be helpful for us in kind of making sure that we understand the request, what the objectives are, that kind of thing. A friendly reminder that this is, right now we're only considering applications from public utility commissions, state energy offices, and public power or cooperative utilities. We are looking for your applications by February 13th. We hope we'll get good response by then, but if you don't make that deadline, you can still reach out to me or fill out the form and we'll do our best to consider your request. But please do aim for that February 13th date, and we will be able to respond quickly within that, after that period. All right, so that's what I have on technical assistance. I would love to be able to take your questions now.
Great, thank you, Grace. This was super informative and really excited about this technical assistance offering, as well as all the great resources you have compiled on Sandboxes. And there was a question on kind of application processes. So sometimes, you know, you have state energy offices that focus on one thing and then PUCs focus on maybe a different topic. Is there like an effort from you all to have diversity? Is it okay if like a state energy offices from the same state and a PUC apply for different topics? Would you like to have them apply as a team? Is there any preference in that regard?
Question. I would hope that the Utility Commission and State Energy Office have similar goals and are working together. To me, that would demonstrate that there's really significant opportunity for impact if the two organizations are working together. So to me, that would be a really exciting application. We'll consider all the requests that come in though. So if both organizations do submit a request, we'll consider them and maybe see if we could find a way to work together. We have a limited pool of funding, so we'll have to make some decisions, likely have to make some decisions about how to allocate those resources. So we're gonna, consider our application based on those scoring criteria and try to get a good diversity of different states and different organizations, different types of questions, that kind of thing. So it kind of just depends on, how many applications come in, who's interested, and how we can make our funding go the longest way it can and maximize use of that.
Great, that's super helpful. Thank you. As state energy offices and PUC sort of ponder about this offering, is one question that came up was, what is actually really the difference between like an expedited pilot process and a regulatory sandbox? Or is like an expedited pilot simply a part of the sandbox? So can you maybe elaborate on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, the terms can be a little confusing. We are basically taking a broad view of what a regulatory sandbox is. And so, the idea really is just that you're trying to modify the regulatory landscape or the approach to innovation to overcome barriers to innovation in your jurisdiction. So in my view, an expedited pilot framework is a type of regulatory sandbox, tries to, really expedite that review timeline, kind of take a different approach to regulation and look at things more quickly compared to a traditional pilot application, which might go through a lengthy regulatory review. So in my view, that's kind of a type of regulatory sandbox. But again, we're taking a broad view here, and I think we want to get creative about how we are addressing barriers and thinking about how we can support innovation to meet those reliability, affordability goals and get advanced grid technologies deployed quickly and to scale.
Great, thank you. I think there were a couple of kind of sort of logistical questions. So one, this is free, correct?
Yes, I should have made that more clear. This is free for states.
Okay, great. I just wanted to be clarifying that. And then you sort of had these different tiers of technical assistance, and the February 13th deadline, does that apply to all of the different tiers or just to like the deep dive that you had mentioned?
Yeah, we are hoping for applications by February 13th for the two kind of more in-depth um, types of assistance, so that expert assistance and the deep dive levels. And it's the same form for both types of requests. And we are hoping for applications by February 13th. If you're requesting an educational briefing or that first level, can reach out at any time, and we'll be able to provide that on an ongoing basis for states, utilities, and even other groups for that one as well.
Right. And what about if states want to explore non-US sandboxes? I mean, I understand the offer is just for state energy offices and PUCs, so by virtue it is for states, and of course some of the different consumer-owned utilities. But if they wanted to explore some of the examples that you mentioned from outside, like Great Britain, for example, is that a possibility, or is sort of the also the area of question also defined, refined, or defined to the states?
It's, yeah, we absolutely would look to examples abroad to help inform, answers to your questions and make sure that we can draw on best practices across the world for implementing Sandbox as well. I think it's really important to look at the examples abroad. One, because they've been running a lot longer than many of the US examples. And two, there's kind of a different landscape abroad that addresses different questions and gets us kind of thinking outside of our own little frameworks here in the US. And we can kind of think broadly about what we can learn from other contexts, other jurisdictions, and how they're doing things. So, absolutely, we'll be happy to look at those with you if that is part of your question.
Okay, great. That is really helpful. Thank you. There were, just coming back to your earlier slides on actually sandbox, there were still a few lingering questions on kind of sandboxes and what the experience has been. Is it your experience that the pilots and activities that have happened in the US in particular in sort of the sandbox format tended to focus more on transmission or more on distribution level relevant applications of these technologies, or is it sort of the same?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in the US, I have seen more focus on distribution level or even like customer sited resources and programs, kind of demand side management, energy efficiency, DERs, that kind of thing. I think that's the nature of kind of the way that our regulatory frameworks are set up here, where our state utility commissions have very direct authority over the distribution system. And that's kind of, where many utilities focus here. But there are definitely examples of transmission activity as well. It just sort of depends on the context of the state and, yeah, the energy landscape in that jurisdiction.
Great, thank you. Um, what is sort of the average time that you've seen to really kind of successfully impact innovation via regulatory sandbox? And how do you ensure that utilities are kind of taking what they've learned in the sandbox and then really applying that going forward?
Yeah, it's such a good question. It's really hard to kind of measure the impact of innovation. I will say, so most of the sandboxes have some sort of time limit on how long individual pilots can run. And then there's also typically sort of a review period for the sandbox mechanism itself. A lot of the individual pilots run for, about a year and a half or maybe up to 2 years. And then there's opportunity to, if you haven't kind of met your goals, try to extend that time period to try to innovate further and really um, gather the experience that you need to get meaningful learning. And then sandboxes themselves, I think we've seen um, run for 3 to 5 years before the commission takes a more holistic review of the mechanism itself and kind of tries to assess how it's been going. I think a lot of these sandboxes again still are sort of in early days in the US. The Connecticut example, I know they're coming up on the first um, the end of the first cycle of pilots, and I think they may have they just submitted a report in December on how those went. Other jurisdictions, there are more results, like in Vermont and California, where these programs have been in place a little bit longer. And we've seen a lot of those projects get to scale. I really like the California Deed Programs project library. You can go and look and see kind of by technology type, by utility, which programs have run and whether or not they got to scale. So you can really kind of see those outcomes and get more evidence more quickly from those as well. So yeah, it kind of varies state by state, but there are examples of successful pilots getting to scale from sandboxes for sure.
Great. And you already mentioned kind of some of the tools that you and your team at the labs have compiled. Is there also you just mentioned the California repository. Is there like more, have you guys done more like a centralized repositories of sandboxes or concepts that have, maybe been part of sandboxes that people can look at to sort of get an idea? And then second part of that question, as you all are, providing technical assistance to the states, will you also kind of have some kind of report out or, analysis of what you've worked with the states on so that other people that might not have done technical assistance aren't there yet could learn from that effort?
Yes. So the report itself, as well as the online toolkit that I mentioned and is linked in these slides, both document sandbox mechanisms across the US and project examples, particularly focused on those advanced T&D technologies. But if you go to the toolkit, there's an interactive map. So you can click on each of the sandbox mechanisms, look at how it's funded, what projects have gone through it, kind of how it was set up, what legislation or commission activity is the basis for it, what the timelines are, all those kind of details on how the sandbox functions. And then we do have a repository of different project examples. It is by no means comprehensive. It does not capture every project that's gone through a sandbox, but it provides some good examples of advanced T&D technologies that utilities have trialed and what the outcomes were from those. So it's kind of a nice resource for you to go and look at. And then in terms of providing report outs from our technical assistants, yes, absolutely would really like to make sure that the projects that we're selecting here will have broader impact beyond just for that state. So we would look to, share out those lessons, and hopefully the activities that we do are replicable and useful for a wide group of jurisdictions.
Yeah, I'm excited to see what you will provide and what comes out of it. Maybe one final question. You mentioned the Vermont program and how that has been successful, and what would you say sort of the scaling process would look like, either in Vermont or in other states? Like where was sort of we talked a little bit already about timeline, but like if you could detail a little bit more the scaling process.
Yeah, sure thing. So again, I think that this is an area for improvement in many sandboxes because it is really challenging. So it's really challenging to assess, like, yes, we trialed this at scale and we think it's successful, but now will the costs and benefits be replicable at scale from this pilot program? We may have tested this project with a single vendor or a single type of technology. Now, do we have to go out to RFP to try to see what other vendors are out there for this similar technology? Kind of there are a lot of implementation questions that make scaling out of pilots or trials really challenging. And I think that's part of why sandboxes try to modify that pilot process to kind of overcome some of those challenges we've seen from that. I'm really hoping that somebody will come in with a technical assistance question on this question of scaling, so that we can work on it and provide some lessons. But there are some good examples out there. So as I mentioned, Vermont, in Vermont, if the utility deems that the pilot has been successful and it kind of meets all of the criteria that they laid out and that the commission has provided as part of the framework, they are able to notify the commission that it will move to tariff. And I believe it's quite expedited, that the commission has maybe 15 or 30 days to act on that proposal for it to move to a tariff program. So quite quick there. In Connecticut, there's a much more structured framework for reviewing which projects will go to scale, and each project has to set out success criteria and successful milestones that they're meeting. And at the end of the trial period, they move to what they call phase 4, which is assessment of whether and how that will scale. In other jurisdictions, the final report on the pilot that has gone through a sandbox mechanism will include recommendations on whether or not it should scale, and then it might move to a more traditional kind of regulatory process to approve a full-scale program. So those are some examples, but again, I think there's a lot of opportunity to improve that process, to get things to scale more quickly, and to think creatively about how we do so.
Fabulous. Now, I know that there's a number of potential people on the call that aren't eligible for this offering. They might be a technology company, or they might work for like a state legislator, um, or for an RTO or others. Is there a way for them to like partner with any of the state energy office PUCs or other eligible entities? Or is that really up to the applicant to kind of decide what the team should look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, this funding is dedicated for those state agencies, energy offices, utility commissions, and public power and municipal utilities. I think if a partnership is something that those types of entities want to explore, we're definitely open to considering that and thinking about how that might work. Um, and then again, sort of the educational briefings, I think we can think about how those might suit different groups beyond, you know, state agencies, but we are really prioritizing state energy offices, PUCs, and those types of utilities for this particular funding and technical assistance opportunity. But I will say, you know, just in general, I think regulatory sandboxes are a great way to bring industry into our regulated utility environment via working groups and stakeholder engagement, advisory councils. You know, a lot of times the regulatory industry or might not have as good familiarity with technology, with venture capital, with some of these like really important topics to innovation. So bringing in outside expertise and partnerships can be really helpful in that. So there's definitely opportunity to get involved.
Sounds great. And from what I've seen from the questions, there's also a lot of appetite. If you ever want to expand any kind of assistance to outside of the United States organizations, I know, of course, not with federal funding, but if the lab is ever so interested in working with non-US entities, I think there might be some appetite there as well, from what I've gathered from the questions. But I think
Interesting.
I think that's really all I got on questions or have questions for you. Let me just make a final check on the Q&A. I don't think I have anything else. So if you want to wrap it up.
Great. I'm just going to go back to the forum link here. Please do apply. If you have questions, you're welcome to reach out to me at any time. My email is linked in these slides. Everything is up on our website. This recording will also be up on our website if you want to revisit anything. And yeah, we look forward to seeing what questions you have and how we can support your efforts. Thank you all so much for joining today. I really appreciate it. And thank you for your great moderation, Kirsten.
Thank you, Grace. It was a pleasure. And again, thank you so much to the labs for doing this and having this technical assistance, and to the state energy offices, PUCs, and municipal utilities. I can highly recommend applying. I've seen the technical assistance efforts from the labs, and it's superb, and it's free, and it's not a lot of effort. So I encourage you all to apply. And thank you again, Grace, for your great presentation.
Thank you.
Bye.